The second piece is recognizing in our mindset that improving schools is really hard. And it doesn't happen in a moment, and it takes a long time. And it takes concentrated effort to get done. And so sometimes we think, oh, well, somebody's going to take care of that, or gosh, this didn't work because they told me that new intervention program would just take care of kids and they'd accelerate 2 years in 1 year and we'd be done. And then we pick something else and we try that and it still doesn't work, and we wonder, well, that thing doesn't work either. And at some point, maybe it's the kid's fault, maybe it's the teacher's fault. We've gone all around in circles. What we know from research, there's been some great meta-analysis that have taken like all these education research studies and they've asked the question, what works? And what they found is almost anything works if you just do it to completion. But we fail, where our failure point is we just stop. We'll take a year, maybe 2, and then we'll say, that just doesn't work. And I think the other piece of this with Common Core coming online and potentially the new assessments in 2014-15, it may be a point where everyone goes, oh, well, Common Core is so different, that's why our kids aren't learning. And we'll start blaming Common Core. And so, but part of this is, the bottom line is school, it's hard. This is hard work. And so we, 1, have to allow for the time. 2, we have to be persistent. 3, we just can't give up. Because, again, the reminder, most things work. And then finally, this sense of urgency, right? That there's some belief that improvement is a must and that you can get better and we actually need to get better. I mean, there's a lot of great research at the student level now on this whole piece on growth mindset, and Carol Dweck out of Stanford has done a lot of it, where we found and challenged this notion that when you give a student an IQ test, that's a fixed thing. That's IQ is, that's what you are. And what they've done to challenge it is they've actually given kids IQ tests, and then they get a score. And then they pull the kid aside and they talk to him and say, you're really smart. Like, you are an intelligent person. And then they send him back and they say, take this IQ test. We want to just check again. And they found statistically significant improvement in the results that students had. And it was simply by telling them they were smart. And I would say this applies not just to our students, but to some of our colleagues, and telling them that they're actually doing a good job, and that we actually can do better and we're smart enough to do it. And so, having that sense that we can actually be better is another important part of mindset. So where I want to close this out with is, I mentioned implementation, and we're at WestEd spending a lot of time on this, because what we're finding is that we have perpetuated this myth of great planning by working with districts and making great plans, and then we think we have it all figured out, and then we come back and we're like, oh, whoa, what happened? And the answer is nothing changed. And so what we're concentrating on is, how do you get people to actually implement something? And some of it has to do with how we initially approach a situation. If people think you're coming in as the expert and going to take care of their problem, that's actually the wrong mindset starting point. Because we know from research, and this research is out of the National Implementation Research Network, NIRN. And you can go to nirn.org if you want. And they've identified through a bunch of evidence-based practices. It emerged out of first mental health, and there's been some stuff done in criminal justice, and it's coming into education right now. That there are these stages to implementation. And the first stage is exploration. You got to know what you need, you got to know what people are at, and you got to figure out what the right fit is going to be. And sometimes what happens is when we have things like the state says, we just go, oh, let's just skip that. They told us to do it. And we don't think about, well, are people actually ready? Do we know what's going on? Do we know what we do right now that's going to change as a result of this? When you think about local control funding, this is where we should be at right now. Exploring what we do and why we do it, and getting people ready to think about options for change. The next step after that is what's called installation. And this is where you get prepared, right? You get organized, you set policies, you might need to have some guidelines. You prepare people, you do the communication, So for those of you that are working actively on Common Core, we should be here right now, right, with Common Core. We should be acquiring our resources. What's that? We're getting teachers trained. We're introducing the standards. We've done some of the mapping. We've started looking at potential materials. We're working on getting ready, which means we're installing. After that, you'll start implementation. So sometimes what happens is we will just buy the book and then we'll say, okay, everyone got the books. That to us is implemented. And the actual piece here is we have to start managing the change. We have to look at our data, look at feedback, figure out if it's actually happening the way we thought it was going to happen, not just for presence, but penetration. And then after that, you get to full implementation. And you can see this is where we start to say we're looking for outcomes. We're going to see results. We're actually monitoring. The key here at the bottom, 2 to 4 years. So this is, I'd say, funding formula changes, same timeline. Common Core implementation, same timeline. So this is that notion that if we don't give it the time it needs and take steps along the way, and we think we can skip some of these, we're actually going to hamper our ability to implement. So one of the things that they've also created is this structure around thinking. Have we thought of everything we need to implement? And these are called they say they're implementation drivers. And there's 3 parts, and there's competency drivers, organizational drivers, and leadership. Now you can probably say, oh yeah, leadership, right? We need somebody to say this is important and y'all need to do it, or I want to help you do it. Okay. But competency drivers is where I think we spend a lot of our time in district improvement and school improvement, where our strategy is, well, if people were just smarter, they'd do better. It's actually an appropriate theory of action, okay? And so what we do is we train, and if we have enough resources, we try to coach. And so the notion is we sometimes skip this idea, selection, because you go, well, we didn't get to pick the people. And that might be true, but who is there will affect what you provide in training and coaching. And as our budgets grow, maybe we actually do get to pick the people. So think about when you have those choices, who you pick will affect what you train and how you coach. And even if you don't get to pick them, you still have to think, what do I need to train them on and how do I coach them? And all of this with in mind of like the goal I have or the what I want to perform in. The other side of this is organizational drivers. So systems interventions. These are the structures that you have in place, policies and procedures. So if we just told everyone that we are focusing on student engagement, and that part of this is during class, but we also then want to provide very interactive learning opportunities outside of school time, then we better actually make sure that in our system we have time. Otherwise, we've just set that up for failure. We just told people to do something, and then we made it impossible to schedule. System interventions are those things that you adopt in terms of your board. If your board says, you said, hey, engagement's the #1 strategy, and then in your board goals, your system says it's actually class size reduction, your system just defeated your training. Okay, the next piece is facilitative administrative. This is the stuff that we do as we manage and support the organization. So if we have in our facilitative administration, we do walkthroughs. We do, we have a process of formative or evaluation with our staff. If we're asking about things that are other than training, then either we needed to change the training or we needed to change what we're looking for or asking, because then we're not supporting it. And sometimes we do that, where we're like, oh, we just got this new thing, we're going to do data dialogues. So we do data dialogues with thoroughness around what's instructional practice, but then we just told everyone else that they need to do these PLCs and they need to be about Common Core. Like we're just kind of like mixing things up. And then the decision support data systems. Like we should be looking at our data and informing what we do, and that's part of our organization. So all of these together are what makes for good implementation of something. And the good news is you don't have to do all of them. They actually relate and they can compensate for one another. So you may say, oh, I got all these people that really don't understand what they need to do. Well, that's fine. Maybe I can make it enforced through the way I evaluate. Maybe I can make it enforced through the way I do my walkthroughs. Maybe I can make it enforced with how I ask people to spend time or structure their lesson plans. So, we got to remember the connections that we all have in all of this. And I think if we can, we get a lot farther. In fact, we actually start to implement something because we have consistency and coherency in our system. So, my plug here is we have a lot of things that might be changing, but there's just good ways to do our work. So how do we make that progress?